It was a foggy evening in Victorian London when I, Dr. James Carrington, received an urgent telegram from my old friend, J.D. J.D., a detective of remarkable intellect and keen observation, had once again found himself embroiled in a perplexing mystery. Without hesitation, I made my way to 221B Baker Street, where J.D.'s residence and office were situated. Upon arrival, I was greeted by J.D.'s landlady, Mrs. Hudson, who ushered me upstairs. I found J.D. deep in thought, surrounded by various violin parts strewn across the room. His piercing blue eyes sparkled with intensity as he turned to face me. "Ah, Carrington," he said, rising to shake my hand. "I see you've come prepared for another adventure." "Indeed, J.D.," I replied. "Your message seemed urgent." "Very much so," J.D. said, motioning for me to sit. "A valuable Stradivarius violin has vanished from the home of Lord Haversham. The instrument is not only priceless but also has significant sentimental value. The police are baffled, and Lord Haversham has turned to me for help." As J.D. briefed me on the case, I couldn't help but marvel at the complexity of the situation. The violin had disappeared from a locked room with no signs of forced entry. Lord Haversham's household staff were all above suspicion, having served him loyally for years. J.D. began his investigation by interviewing the household staff. Mrs. Thompson, the housekeeper, was particularly distressed. "I've worked for Lord Haversham for 20 years, she said tearfully. "I would never betray his trust." J.D.'s sharp eyes missed nothing. He noted the tiniest details, the way Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled, the slight smudge on the polished floor, and the faint scent of lavender in the air. "I believe the answer lies in the mundane," J.D. mused. "Often, the most intricate puzzles have the simplest solutions." He decided to inspect the locked room from which the violin had vanished. The room was immaculate, with the exception of a single violin string lying on the floor. J.D. picked it up and examined it closely. "Carrington, do you recall the case of the scarlet thread?" J.D. asked, his eyes alight with excitement. "Of course," I replied, recalling the intricate plot of a previous adventure. "This string is similar," J.D. continued. "Notice the frayed end. It suggests that the violin was tampered with before the theft." J.D.'s next move was to question Lord Haversham's visitors. Among them was a renowned violinist, Madame Cecilia, who had performed at a recent soiree. Madame Cecilia was known for her exceptional talent and her eccentricities. When J.D. and I visited Madame Cecilia, she was rehearsing in her opulent drawing room. She greeted us warmly but seemed unusually nervous. "Madame Cecilia, what can you tell us about your recent visit to Lord Haversham?" J.D. inquired. Her fingers fidgeted with her violin bow. "Lord Haversham invited me to inspect his Stradivarius. It's a magnificent instrument. I would never dream of harming it." J.D.'s eyes narrowed. "And yet, you were the last person to see it before it vanished." Madame Cecilia's composure cracked. "I only wanted to play it once, to feel its exquisite sound. But I swear, I left it in its case untouched." J.D. thanked her and left. As we walked back to Baker Street, J.D. shared his deductions. "Madame Cecilia's obsession with the Stradivarius is evident," he said. "But she did not steal it. The true thief is someone much closer to Lord Haversham." Back at the Haversham estate, J.D. called for a meeting with all the household staff. He meticulously laid out the timeline of the theft, pointing out discrepancies in their statements. Finally, he turned to Mrs. Thompson. "You were the only one with access to the room during the crucial hours. The scent of lavender, your trembling hands, you're hiding something." Mrs. Thompson broke down, confessing that her son, an aspiring musician, had persuaded her to let him borrow the violin to impress a wealthy patron. She had planned to return it before anyone noticed, but things had gone awry. J.D. recovered the violin from Mrs. Thompson's son, who had hidden it in a dilapidated warehouse. Lord Haversham was grateful for J.D.'s swift resolution of the case and forgave Mrs. Thompson, understanding a mother's love for her child. As we sat by the fire that evening, J.D. played a haunting melody on his violin. The Stradivarius safely returned to its rightful owner. "Another case solved, Carrington," J.D. said with a satisfied smile. "Indeed, J.D.," I replied, raising my glass, "to justice and to the brilliance of your mind." And thus, the curious case of the vanishing violin was closed, thanks to the unparalleled intellect and observational prowess of my friend, the great detective J.D.